Hi everyone, how are you doing? Now I can see 8 people who are waiting according to YouTube. Aha, okay, you're in. You are watching now. Welcome everyone. I'm just going to give this a minute or two to just make sure everyone is online and hearing the content at the same time. There's a fine tradition globally in academia that one does not actually start the important content until 5 minutes past the allotted hour. So we'll just wait here. If you're here, and please say hi in the written chat now, so that I know you are here, and so on. It would reassure me greatly. I'm going to use the confirmation bias here. If one person says hi in the chat and that they can hear me, I'm going to assume that everybody can. Hello. Excellent, excellent. Fatally Orange and Zoe. Okay, this is great. Now I will... Ooh, there are all 8 people watching now. Okay, a quick background quiz for all of you. Who has watched the little video that Inky and I made that went up either last night or this morning? Who has watched that? Oh no! Okay, well look, whilst we wait, just I didn't find it either. Oh, I'm sorry. Look, for I'll put it here in the chat for fun. It's not necessary. Then we'll just go through the content here together. Anyway, let's have a look. Okay, well there it is. Look. Honestly, I was not assuming that everyone would have seen it anyway. I was planning on going through the content again. We'll go through it here, sort of gently and slowly, and I can keep. The great thing is I can just stop and ask questions the whole time. When you're delivering content to a camera, usually you're just tearing along at warp speed, assuming that everything is perfectly clear. I mean, the only things listening to me when I gave that content were like Inky and the birds in the trees. So no one was being a terribly harsh critic. The great thing is that content is there and you can watch it whenever you want. Also, what I'm happy to do is to stick a copy of the file itself up on WeTransfer, and Sasha can send that download link from WeTransfer around, and then that way you can download the content onto your own devices if you want to, if streaming is ever an issue. And please, I really do mean this sincerely. Usually if we're face to face, what I say to everyone, no matter how many people are in the auditorium or a little tutorial room or whatever it is, I say, if you're not understanding something that I'm saying, there's only one person whose fault that is, and it's mine. So you've absolutely got to interrupt me whenever you feel like doing so. Usually I don't need to wait for you to interrupt me, because if I look up at a lecture theatre or something and I've been terribly unclear, usually the expression on hundreds upon hundreds of people's faces kind of gives it away, right? It's hard for 600 students to pretend that they're understanding something. Usually it's everyone just going like, what? And I go, oh, okay, I should do that bit again. Now, there's a little bit of delay here with YouTube. It's not quite instantaneous. It's just about 5 seconds or something. But please, when I get going with this content, I'm going to stop and ask you if you have any questions all the time. But also, if I'm just prattling on and it's literally incomprehensible, right, then what I want you to do is to just write in the comments in all caps, like a power move. There's all caps with exclamation marks to say, Seb, stop! What are you on about? And then we'll take our time. We've got a lot of time here to get through the content, and I promise you we will. So if that's okay with everyone, I'll just get on and begin. But just before I do, are there any questions from any of you before we start about any of this? Because I don't want to get going if one of you had something burning. So I'll sit here and say nothing for 10 seconds and let the buffer catch up. All right. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3 Mississippi. 4 Mississippi. 5 Mississippi. 6 Mississippi. 7 Mississippi. 8 Mississippi. 9 Mississippi. 10 Mississippi. Well then, I guess so much is so clear. Where should we access the video later? I have posted the link in the YouTube chats above, so it's just above your comment. That's a good question. And Sasha will spam all of you with it. So yeah, I've posted it in the written chat here in the YouTube chat section. Oh, you mean where should we access this actual video that we're doing now? Literally no idea, but if that's what you mean, Sasha will take care of it. They will be put somewhere, but I'm not sure where they live, right? But we'll make it clear. But the video that I pre-recorded, I've put the link to that here in the chat section. Excellent question. The link I sent isn't in the chat. There's nothing from Seb SG in the chat.
Well, BCT Crib said that's really expensive. Fine, I'll try and do it myself. But if you're just trying to get a project done.
So no one can see written comment. Can you see any written? I'll write one. Let's just make sure this works. So can you? Okay, so this comment is Seb SG. Aha, great. All right. Then, fear not. God, we are on fire here. Right? Okay. Here is the link. I'll try it again. Copy. Here is link. Now, in those comments that I just typed into the comment box, there should be links after them. At least one of them should work. Can you see at least one of them? This is bizarre. Maybe YouTube strips links out of the comment dialog box. Nothing showed up. That's very strange, but you could see my written comment. Yeah, YouTube must have something. Okay. That's bizarre. I don't understand why that is happening. But presumably there is some way of emailing your cohort, and I'll send a link around like that and Sasha can spam me with it. Okay. So, here's the point, right? Here's how I'm thinking of normative ethics for computer scientists, right? I encourage you all to think of humans as a device, as a device, and designed or naturally occurring. Who cares? It's a device that we can hack. Right? Have to think of humans from outside for a moment. You know. Now, the thing about humans is they're great. They're useful for all sorts of things. Humans are lots of fun, and sometimes they get on, and sometimes they don't, and but sometimes they just do really annoying things. I mean, sometimes they start wars, sometimes they enslave millions of people, sometimes they destroy entire continents and cultures, sometimes they're quite cruel to each other, other times they don't wipe the butter off the knife before using the jar of Vegemite, all sorts of horrible things. And what we're worrying about here with the business of normative ethics, and I'll explain what the normative bit means in a moment, is we're just trying to come up with some type of system by which we might be able, hopefully, to improve the way that humans operate towards each other living things, and their environment. Now, the whole point of normative ethics is it provides norms for behavior. That's why it's called normative ethics. Another name for this, it means exactly the same thing, is prescriptive ethics. Prescriptive ethics and normative ethics are just absolutely interchangeable. They're synonymous terms. The point of providing norms for behavior is that normative ethics provides instructions for how it is that we should and shouldn't act. Now, probably the most well-known system of normative ethical principles in Western civilization would be the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments is a fantastic example of a system of normative principles. It's basically a list of prescriptions or normative rules about what we should and shouldn't do. And as far as any list of normative rules that start with what we should and shouldn't do goes, that the Ten Commandments is not a terribly bad place to start. I mean, most cultures will have something that's not entirely unlike the Ten Commandments in it somewhere. Usually most cultures frown upon killing and stealing and so on. I mean, that is not that weird. You can go up to just about anybody anywhere on the planet, and if they've got like a thing, and you run up and you pinch their thing and run off with it, they're going to be a bit upset. Even small children, if they've got a twig in their hand and you just take off with it, they're going to be miffed at you, right? They're going to start crying. So it's not, I don't think it's all that weird that we have things like don't steal turning up in sort of moral rules all around the planet. Similarly with, don't kill people, or killing is wrong. Most organisms tend to exercise some judicious amounts of effort when it comes to self-preservation and so on. But in the business of normative ethics writ large, what we're really concerned with is just some system to which we can appeal, that we can use to help us work out whether or not some particular thing or other is in fact the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, morally speaking. We're not just talking about the right or wrong thing to do insofar as some set of instructions are concerned. We're talking about the right or wrong thing to do morally. And normative ethics takes the idea that morality is a special topic. There are three main theories of normative ethics, we'll call them. The first one that we're going to look at today is known as consequentialism, and we're going to look at one particular type of it, known as utilitarianism or utilitarian ethics. It is terribly popular at the moment. The second type of normative ethics at which we're going to look is known as either Kantian ethics or deontological ethics, or sometimes rule-based ethics. I'm going to use all of those terms interchangeably. Just Kantian deontological rule-based ethics. It's the second type of normative ethics. And finally, last but certainly, as we will see not least, we're going to look at virtue ethics, which is in fact the oldest of all three. We're going back in time as we look at all of these. And I'm going to use analogies with device optimization to explain them to all of you, and hopefully try and convince you that there's something right about all of them. You know, there's no way that millions of people for 100 or so years are going to believe some theory of how it is that we should go about ethical reasoning if it's entirely false. You know, nothing that is entirely false like that is terribly convincing. So before I leap on head first into consequentialism, consequentialist ethics, whatever you want to call it, I'll just pause for a moment and ask, are there any questions from any of you whatsoever? Possibly not this early in the game, but just in case. I'll skip ahead. 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi, 9 Mississippi. No, it doesn't look like it. Okay, fantastic. Now, the whole point of consequentialism is to move away from rule worship. The idea, morally speaking, if one of it is a consequentialist, is that whether or not something is the right or wrong thing to do has got nothing to do with the act in and of itself. Yes, so it is exactly like a set of moral standards. All of them are. Except maybe virtue ethics. Good question. The point, if you're a consequentialist, is you think that acts or actions themselves do not have any intrinsic moral value at all. Rather, any moral value that an act has will be derivative. It will be derivative on the consequences of that action. Now, why would anyone think anything like this? Well, because around the end of the 19th century in Western philosophy and in a lot of Western cultures, there are a lot of things. It was a time of great social change. There were a lot of things that people thought were the right thing to do morally, but a bunch of other people turned around and couldn't help but notice that the actual consequences of following these sort of moral principles were actually bringing about or enabling states of affairs with terrible moral properties. So if we're going to just ignore the consequences of our actions altogether, then we're missing something terribly important when it comes to moral theorizing or moral concerns or ethical reasoning in general. Probably the most well-known version of consequentialism, I'm going to talk about this in more detail, is what's known as utilitarianism. Some of you might have heard of Peter Singer, who is a famous utilitarian. The point of utilitarianism is that, along with consequentialists in general, they think that the point of acting morally is to maximize the good and minimize the bad. Utilitarians think that ultimately the only intrinsic good is happiness, and the intrinsic bad, that is its counterpoint, is suffering, which is unhappiness. There is happiness and suffering or unhappiness. We're going to use unhappiness and suffering interchangeably here. So the point of acting morally, if one is a utilitarian, is to optimize or maximize happiness over unhappiness. And that's known as a utility measurement. The whole point of acting morally is to maximize utility. Now, why might you think something like this? Because we have a tendency as a species to justify appalling behavior that causes rather a lot of suffering in terms of us being just convinced of our own moral superiority and us trying to convince other people that actually we really are doing the right thing here. So I'll give you an example. It's one I gave in the pre-recorded lecture. It's an example in Australian culture that I lived through when I was a child. I'll prefix this by saying that I was never hit as a child. My mother didn't believe in hitting children, but certainly in the 80s it was standard procedure to just beat the living heck out of your children, often with sticks. You know, if you went further back in Australian culture to the 70s, 60s, 50s and 40s, you could beat the living hell out of your children with all sorts of things. And it was absolutely not anybody else's business, you know. It was how you trained children. Well, it was the right thing to do. It was to teach them right from wrong, apparently. And then there was this sort of change of consciousness in the 80s in Australia where, before long, a critical mass of people started to argue that, if the only way that you can educate a small child as to the difference between right and wrong is by beating them until they're screaming and crying in pain with a stick, perhaps you need to try just a little bit harder, right? So this would be one particular example where a sort of utilitarian worldview has made the world a happier place and alleviated some suffering. The utilitarian ethics has definitely made the world a kinder and gentler place in a lot of respects. If we're thinking about it in device optimization terms, it's a way of optimizing or upgrading the operating system of your device that depends on empirical evidence. There's no system of pure algorithmic refinement that will tell you how to do this. If you're a consequentialist, you simply have to get empirical data from the world after your human devices have been running around in it a little bit. It's predicated on empirical data here. And before I go much further, there's a really important distinction here that's probably not made often enough in ethics. So we're going to talk at length today, we're going to discuss at length the difference between a whole bunch of normative ethical theories, but for the most part we're not really going to talk about to whom these theories or systems of ethics apply. We're just going to take it for granted that it's all humans, But this is an incredibly recent turn of events, I can promise you. Even take the Ten Commandments again, as one example. The Ten Commandments was simply a system of rules for how it is that one member of the tribe of Israel was to treat another member of the tribe of Israel. Anyone who was not a member of the tribe was fair game. I mean, the Ten Commandments didn't apply to them at all. And this is something that we still battle with as a species, I think, today. The idea that whatever our code of morals happens to be, it applies to all people equally, and not just to some people more than others because they happen to be, say, the members of our own family or our own tribe or own religion or own country or own culture or own race or own gender, and so on. I think you get the idea. Contemporary utilitarianism and also just contemporary thinking has argued that this sort of system of ethics that we think is good enough for ourselves should probably be good enough for a whole bunch of other non-human animals as well. And again, until quite recently in Australia, it was okay to beat your pets if that's what you felt like doing, and it was nobody else's business. Now it's flat out illegal. You can get into a lot of trouble. One of Greta Thunberg's points, the really great climate activist, has been that we need to consider not just all humans alive today, but also all future humans. We need to bring, presently non-concretely existent, but soon to exist future humans. We need to include them within our system of moral concern as well. With the recent refugee crisis in Europe, when Angela Merkel opened the borders of Germany to millions and millions of refugees from the Middle East, a lot of people in Germany, a lot of politicians were saying, but what if some of these people are rapists and murderers and terrorists? How do we know they're not? And she said, I don't know that they're not. Some of them probably are, just by sheer weight of numbers. We're talking about millions of people here. I don't know that they're all good people, but that doesn't matter. What I do know is that they're all people, and that's the salient property here. That's actually what matters. That was quite a wonderful thing for somebody to say in the political hot seat. It's quite remarkable if you think about it, right? So we should keep in mind the scope of our moral umbrella. Who falls under it? Can people be excluded for various reasons or not? Is there a price of entry, or is inclusion just automatic? Can people be excommunicated and shunned from the scope of the moral umbrella or not? Is that itself an immoral thing to do? That's a segue, but it is an important one. I think it is an important one. So and utilitarians have gone further than anyone else to include, to make us all concentrate on the scope of one's moral umbrella rather than just the nature of that moral umbrella itself. Now, utilitarianism has been terribly popular with scientists and computer scientists and engineers and scientifically minded people. Well, why? Because it's thoroughly naturalistic and it lets us subsume moral reasoning within the space of falsifiable empirical data. How so? You say something like, well, think of the scientific method. I've got my theory. It's the hypothetico-deductive method. For those of you who don't know, spell that one. Right? Here's how the hypothetico-deductive method works. You say, I've got my theory T, and gee, I wonder if theory T is true. And theory T has a whole bunch of consequences, and then you go around making observations to see if those consequences are falsified. If you can make an observation of something that is contrary to the consequences that were predicted by the theory. And if those consequences are contradicted by the data that you're observing, you know that you need to go back and revise your theory. Well, utilitarianism works just like this. That's why it's loved by scientists. Again, it subsumes moral concern within the world of empirical evidence. How so? Again, because I think, okay, I'm grinding away with my utilitarian calculations, and I think that, the right thing to do, morally speaking, is such and such, so I start doing this and I convince a lot of other people to do this, and then we look around and we think, oh, blimey, well, I guess we kind of thought that was the right thing to do, but look, everyone looks really unhappy. Maybe we were wrong. We need to go back to this moral, this thing that we thought was the right thing to do and change it, because again, if you're a utilitarian or any consequentialist, actions themselves have no intrinsic moral value at all. They have a moral value, of course. They have a moral status. But that value or status is purely derivative on the consequences that they cause for us and for living things. So this is how utilitarianism works. This is just the rough outline of utilitarianism. It's a hard-nosed, there's no room for supernatural moral properties floating up there, outside of the physical world or anything, where there's just hard-nosed observations of people's happiness or unhappiness, and at extreme ends it shouldn't be that hard to tell, so says the utilitarian. And this is how we work these things out. Now, of course, when it comes to very fine-grained observations of happiness versus unhappiness, then things will get a bit tricky, and we've got to sit down and think about it. But for the most part, the utilitarians will say, listen, thinking about all of this stuff is a necessary cost of entry into being a responsible moral theorist in today's day and age. You don't just get to stand up there on the basis of moral principle and saying, I'm doing the right thing because this is a moral axiom and the consequences don't matter. That sort of thing doesn't have the best track record in the history of human civilization. So let's stop doing that. Let's actually look at the effect empirically of our moral decisions, and our assessment of our moral decisions should be a function of the consequences of those moral decisions themselves. So this is utilitarianism. Before we look at some problems for it, I want to stop here to see what questions you might have about utilitarian ethical theory itself. Over to you. Okay, I'm going to take the lack of questions here in the chat now, as there have actually been none. Okay, so let's talk about some problems for consequentialist ethics. The main one is this. It looks like for the utilitarian... Ooh, wait, we have a question. Hang on. Aha. So from Anazur Roy, this is an excellent question. How do you measure the consequences of happy versus unhappy, and how far does it go? Like, I'm very happy after eating chocolate, but after many chocolate eating sessions, I'll be unhappy with health. Right. Anasuya, you and I can be friends. I ate a whole bunch of chocolate just before we went live for moral fortitude. This is one of the obvious problems. It's a right one to pick on for utilitarianism. Like, how do you go around measuring all of this stuff? And firstly, how do you tell? And what the utilitarians say is like, well, look, for any sort of large-scale moral decisions, I mean, the sort of ones that you might make if you're in a position of power, you're thinking about, laws or something like that. it should it should be pretty obvious if it's making too many people desperately unhappy. So there are some good examples. If the consequences of your imposing these sort of rules and regulations on everyone because you think that they're going to have the right consequences is a state of affairs for people that's just so dire that everybody wants to leave the place over which you're in charge. It's probably not a great track record. Some fantastic examples of this would be, anywhere that's sort of a despotic or autocratic regime, where the only way that you can get people to stay there is by surrounding the entire landmass or area with fences and barbed wire and guns and landmines and just shooting anyone who tries to leave, because you've basically created a huge country-sized draconian hellhole, largely because you are completely mad. And this happened. Humans, we fail at doing this sort of stuff pretty tragically all the time. So utilitarians will say for really large-scale important decisions, some of the consequences should be pretty obvious en masse. I think much harder to predict ones, and ones that are really contentious. I'm trying to think of something that's been worried about right now in terms of consequences. I think, in Australia right now there's a big discussion about. An even better example would be marriage equality and the gay marriage debate that we were having quite recently in Australia. It wasn't quite as good and as a sophisticated a debate as I think it should have been, but the upshot, I think, was one of the best pro arguments, which is simply that, well, look, it's not like marriage is a finite resources, and if non-straight people get some of the marriage, there'll be less of it for straight people or something. Like, oh no, a gay couple got married, and now I can't get married anymore because they took the bit of marriage I was going to take. So that's not a reason, and it's causing obvious sadness and suffering to people who would like to declare their lifelong love and dedication to each other in just the same way as people have for thousands of years with vows and declarations of marriage. And for many people, it's a really wonderful institution, and excluding non-straight couples from the practice is just sort of cruel and unnecessarily so. And that argument won the day. And so far, I'm not aware of anyone who has not been able to get married as a consequence. And I'm not sure that. Sorry, there's a very loud helicopter going over. I'm just going to wait. I'm not sure if the microphone's picking that up, but it's something. Okay, it has gone. I'm not aware of anyone who genuinely believes that their present marriage is now worth less, and now, they're sad and then about their marriage because now we have marriage equality and the meaning of their marriage has changed or something like this. An even more current example of utilitarian argument would be drug prohibition and drug criminalization. There's a lot of argument in Australia now for decriminalization of currently illegal drugs from a perspective of what's known as harm minimization. The whole point of harm minimization is it's coming from a consequentialist perspective. It's just assumed where the point of laws is that they're supposed to minimize harm. They're not. We don't codify laws just on wanton moral principle for no other reason. Someone's decided that this is the right thing to do because, I don't know, they checked somewhere the book of moral principles. They came back and said, yes, this is definitely the right thing to do. So we've made something illegal, and they're saying, well, right now, drug prohibition is destroying whole Central American countries and countries and all over the world because of the drug trade, and it's funding crazy, violent criminals, and it's causing people to overdose and die because they don't know what's in their drugs, and it's making the police behave terribly and sexually assault teenagers at music festivals, and it makes it ruins the relationship between the police and the community and everything, and a whole bunch of ex-police officers all say exactly the same thing. No one except politicians who are trying to get voted in. Not a single doctor thinks it's a good idea. Everyone's just saying, look, this is obviously the cure is worse than the disease here, right? The criminalization is causing more harm than decriminalization would cause. So why are we doing it? And then there's some really sincere people who are saying, like, no, if we decriminalize it, it will lead to even more drug abuse. And oh my goodness, have you seen how Australians behave with alcohol? Can you imagine how they'd start behaving if, I don't know, if you could buy crystal meth down at the greengrocer or something like that? So there's a real argument about what the actual consequences would be, and it's not entirely obvious. So that's the sort of thing that utilitarians get going on with the consequences themselves. As for the chocolate argument, well, then that was the utilitarian. That then you've just given the utilitarian all the data they need. There's nothing wrong with eating a little bit of chocolate, but an awful lot wrong about eating a lot of it. Although I'm not sure if the utilitarians have all that much to say about gluttony as a vice. But as we'll see, the virtue ethicists will when we get there. But thanks. And I assume that's a really great question. Have I answered it? Is that a good enough answer? Or should I elaborate? Okay, great, fantastic. I'll carry on. If there are no other questions, I will just carry on. If you do have them, just type them in. And thank you. Type in all caps and keep copy pasting, and I'll suddenly notice. It's tiny font. But there are big problems for utilitarianism, because it looks like, suppose just hypothetically that the vast majority of people would be really happy if a small number of a specific cohort of people were made to suffer a great deal. Let's just suppose that all non-red-haired people in Australia would be absolutely overjoyed at the idea that all red-haired people were forced into brutal, violent slavery, tortured on a whim, whipped on the street. Like proper old-school chain gang whipping, thrown into vats of boiling oil, Egyptian-style slavery. I'm not mucking around here. Slave driver sort of stuff. Worked until they die, that sort of thing. Now, people with red hair would suffer immensely, but they are far below a majority of the population, right? That's absolutely true. Now, by utilitarian lights, it looks like the right thing to do here, morally speaking, if this was in fact the case, would be to violently and brutally enslave all red-haired people. In other words, sorry, I have pollen in my throat. I apologize. The problem, generalizing, for utilitarianism here is that the ends will always justify the means. The response from utilitarians is to say this, is to say, you know what, you're absolutely right. We haven't thought about utilitarianism carefully enough here. All we've been thinking about in terms of the right or the wrong thing to do is just the consequences of individual actions treated as, islands in themselves. And maybe that's not quite what we should be doing. And instead what we should be doing is thinking about the consequences not of every individual action on their own, but rather of some sort of a rule about actions, the general following of which is either more or less likely to have certain consequences. So this is best seen by an example. Take slavery. Again, I'm using slavery as an example because it's supposed to be an example of something that is uncontroversially the wrong thing to do. My other favorite one is the burning puppies. So you've got slavery and the burning puppies. They're both supposed to be uncontroversially wrong. Uncontroversially. Good. Okay. So what the utilitarians say, after thinking about this for a moment, is, let's think about a rule, the general following of which is more or less likely to maximize utility. And now if this rule was, you should not enslave people, ever, and the general following of that is likely to maximize utility as opposed to minimize it, then that seems just about right, because usually when there's slavery going on, there's a lot of unhappiness. That's why you have to chain up your slaves, because otherwise they'll run away, because you're making their lives horrible. And if there was no general rule against slavery, it would probably be rather widespread, because people are quite terrible, and it would you'd end up in a society where, by and large, the vast majority of people were not happy at all, and were very, very unhappy. So this new form of utilitarianism that replaces the old utilitarianism. The old utilitarianism says, an act is the right act if the consequences of that act results in the maximization of utility. That's now known as act utilitarianism. What rule utilitarians say is that an act is the right act or not if it falls under a rule, the general following of which is more likely than not to maximize utility. And now the rule utilitarians and the act utilitarians just argue amongst each other about which version of utilitarianism is in fact the right one. It's very much an argument that's going on today. There's no consensus here, but that is, as we're speaking now, by and large, a rough and ready tour of the state of play with utilitarianism. Now, before we move from utilitarianism into Kantian deontological ethics, I'd like to know if you have any questions at all about utilitarianism, the differences between act and rule utilitarianism, problems for act utilitarianism. There are also problems for rule, but this is not like a 2-hour seminar on an introduction to everything that's happening in utilitarianism. And it's a pretty good overview, I think. Again, just remember that it's empirical data that matters for the utilitarian when they're trying to upgrade the moral operating system of humans. You've got to see what the humans start doing to each other and what the states is of each of the individual humans, and you have to look at populations as a whole and then start tweaking things. That's how it works. It's an evidence-based moral theory. Because there are facts of the matter about whether or not we're happy or unhappy. They might be hard to measure, they might be hard to observe, but happiness is a state of mind, suffering is a state of mind, and we can be in each of them to varying degrees across varying dimensions of ourselves, and they're the things that the consequentialists think matter when it comes to ethical reasoning. Let's wait a little while longer because last time I think there's also a lag with the typing of your questions, so I'll give it another 20 seconds or so. Okay. Murphy's Law, as soon as I start talking about Kantian deontological ethics, you'll have a whole bunch of questions that come through on the chat, but we will survive nonetheless. Now, Kantian ethics, named after Immanuel Kant, the great rationalist philosopher. Rationalism means something very specific in philosophy. It probably doesn't mean what you think it means. If you already have a belief about what you think it might mean, it doesn't really matter what it means here. But it's used incorrectly in day-to-day academic reasoning, unfortunately. You're not entirely unlike positivism in terms like that. Kantian or deontological ethics, in its simplest form, is just the brute rejection of consequentialism, even though it predates it. Consequences just don't matter at all, insofar as that the moral status of various actions are concerned. If you're a Kantian ethicist, as far as Kant is concerned, things are absolutely morally right, and we have a duty to perform them, or they're absolutely morally wrong, and we have a duty to not perform them, and the consequences don't matter at all. And what's matter? And the other thing, I should say, the fascinating thing is that Kant thinks you can work all of this out just by thinking about it very carefully in terms of just brute computation, just by reflecting on certain ethical principles that we'll get to shortly. We can arrive at facts about normative moral principles, and the consequences have nothing to do with it. Moral reasoning, it has no connection whatsoever to empirical data. Rather, moral reasoning has everything to do with acts of pure reason or pure rationality, or optimized moral algorithms. And he actually has an algorithm that is a decision procedure for moral rules. It's called the Categorical Imperative. Doesn't matter what it is for now, because we're going to get there, and I'll explain it to you in probably about 5 or 10 minutes. Right. Now, Kantian and deontological ethicists are motivated by a really intuitive idea, something along the lines of, look, slavery is always wrong. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. If you've got a whole bunch of people, like a majority of people, who are just made super happy by slavery, then they've all got something wrong with them, and that's not a good enough reason to start brutally enslaving and torturing a whole bunch of people just because it would have certain consequences. Indeed, we have an obligation to stop slavery. In general, why? Well, here's why. Kant thinks that, this is a very popular idea, as we'll see, that the mark of a human person, the thing that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, is our capacity or our potential for rational behavior, for rational action. Of course, Kant's not weird enough to think that we're always acting rationally, but at least we have the potential to do so. When we reflect upon our reasons to act in the situation, the environment we're in, and so on, and we act deliberatively, we can act rationally. And when we do so, according to Kant, we're acting freely. We're acting on the basis of our own operating system, and we can, if we try, upgrade our own operating system. We can, if we think about it and learn and become educated, we can get better at thinking, We can become better at thinking about thinking and so on. And when we deploy all of these skills and properties of persons to the way that we act every day, then we are acting freely. We're acting on the basis of our own reasons. And something like slavery, well, undermines that. It impedes it, it obstructs it, it ruins it. It takes away from us our freedom to act on the basis of rationality, and that means it takes away our very humanity, our very personhood. So Kant thinks that some things really are absolutely right or absolutely wrong because of the threats that they pose. Kant takes the integrity and freedom of a person very, very seriously. Now, Kant has a way of working out what the right and the wrong thing is to do that is very different to the consequentialist. Again, the consequentialists have a way of working out what the right and the wrong thing is to do, but that way involves observing the consequences of those actions. Kant's method of working out what the right and wrong thing to do has nothing to do with consequences at all, but everything to do with this thing he calls the categorical imperative, and I'm going to explain this now. Usually, it is explained terribly, terribly badly. It's either incomprehensible or it's a parody. The parody is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You know, that is not the categorical imperative. That absolutely is not it. Right? I promise you. What the categorical imperative is this. Now I'm going to give it in its full Kantian glory. It's not going to make any sense, but I want to say it in its full Kantian glory and then explain it really carefully. Right? So the categorical imperative is as follows. Act only according to that maxim that you could at the same time will to be a universal law. That's perfectly unclear in every way. I'll repeat it and then I'll explain what it means. What it means is really simple. Act only according to that maxim that you could at the same time will to be a universal law. What does that mean? Well, it just means the following. When he says act only according to that maxim, by maxim he means some kind of moral prescription, some sort of moral rule, right? So he says act only according to that moral rule, right? If you could at the very same time really honestly desire that that moral rule becomes a universal law under which everyone is bound. In other words, everyone else has to follow it. So in simplified contemporary day-to-day everyday English, the categorical imperative is as follows. Like, look, act only according to some moral principle. If you could at the same time really genuinely be happy to run or control the behavior of everybody else as well. You have to be happy for everybody else to follow that same moral rule, no matter what it is. So the idea that there's one rule for you and one rule for other people, you know, that's not on at all if you can't. Now, so slavery, let's use slavery as an example. You should, according to Kant, here's an instance of the categorical imperative using slavery. You should only enslave people and believe truly that it's the moral thing to do. If you could at the same time be perfectly happy for everybody else to act as though they were obligated to enslave people as well. And Kant thinks, well, that just doesn't make any sense. That's literally inconceivable. Because if everybody thought that enslaving people was okay, everybody would be enslaving everybody, and then you can't have everyone enslaving everyone. You're teaching on the brink of some sort of contradiction. The situation is literally, as Kant says, inconceivable. So just through an act of pure reasoning, we have come to realize through a fearless deployment of our faculties of intellectual prowess, we've realized that slavery is wrong is actually a moral principle. We have a categorical imperative to uphold that moral duty because we've just realized that if we don't, we end up in some state of affairs that makes no sense. Kant really takes this quite seriously. He thinks that the categorical imperative will lead us to be able to conceive of situations that are teetering on the brink of genuine inconceivability, and there's just no way that society could function. So we know that slavery is absolutely a moral wrong, no matter if it happens to make people happy. I mean, Kant wasn't very big on happiness. If you read about Kant's life and you read a lot of his philosophy, he's a fairly austere kind of a person. Sort of German idealism and whenever Kant, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, whenever Kant was writing. So this is the categorical imperative and how it works. The idea is that you should only act according to some kind of moral rule if you could genuinely be really happy that everybody acts according to that same moral rule. Is this making sense? Are there any questions? Aha. So does this mean... Excuse me. The pollen is out of control today. So does this mean that two different people can come to two different conclusions about what the good action is because people reason differently? A good question. If you're Kant, the answer is no. Kant thinks that that moral reasoning, if done correctly, is as canonical as is mathematical reasoning. We don't get to disagree. The whole point of the categorical imperative is that it gives us an algorithm for moral reasoning, a bit like timetables, and anyone who's smart enough is able to work out what the right moral principle is. Of course, a problem here is this subsumes moral reasoning within the entire domain or space of pure rational thought, within the same space as is geometry and algebra and logic and so on. The consequence of this is that stupid people can't be good if you're Kant, right? Yeah, absolutely. Kant is an objective moral realist. He thinks that the moral principles have exactly the same status as do logico-mathematical axioms, and we exercise our faculties of reason to know them. To know them. Yeah, Kant is not joking. Contemporary deontological ethicists are definitely not joking. Good questions, Anasuya.
If they're not kind of answering quite the question or something like that, you can jump in to clarify.
That's the whole point, is that the moral principles are principles of pure reason. Nothing to do with the consequences whatsoever. Now, this is going to lead to some problems.
But the thing is, if I'm leading with a question, you can actually...
Take lying, for example. Kant thinks that we have a categorical imperative to not lie. Here's his example again, using the categorical imperative. I think, well, suppose I think it's that we don't have a categorical imperative to always tell the truth, to never lie. So we think it's permissible for people to lie. But then people would be lying to each other all the time. And if people were lying to each other all of the time, there wouldn't be a lot of trust in society. In fact, if people were lying to each other all of the time, there probably wouldn't be any trust at all. And if there wasn't any trust at all, then there wouldn't be any long-lasting social conventions because they'd all get broken. There'd be nothing like a social contract because people would keep breaking it. Remember, contracts are basically promises. Before too long, their whole communities would be undone. Communities, in fact, would never form in the first place. If we're backtracking here, we're thinking counterfactually. If people have always thought it was permissible to lie, and Kant says it's not a mistake. It's not mysterious that most cultures on the planet frown on lying, and people get in trouble for lying, and you're supposed to tell the truth. Have a look around. I encourage you to do this just as a matter of fact, empirically. If you look around the world at cultures where just brazenly lying all the time is an entrenched practice, and there are places on the planet like this, by and large, these places are an absolute disaster, right? They're not working. They're not working very well, right? Well, I'll let you figure this out on your own. But at least officially, the general story is you're not supposed to lie, right? So this Kant thinks is not mysterious. If there was no trust, there'd be no social conventions. If there are no social conventions, there'd be no social contract. If there are no social contract, there'd be no large-scale communities. If there were no large-scale communities, then we wouldn't have anything like the stable societies that we need in order for a life of knowledge and philosophy and technological innovation and so on to flourish in the first place. We need a lot of public trust there before anything like this is achievable. And often, just getting that point of intersocial, interpersonal, society-wide harmony across a civilization that's a necessary step for everything else. People are always lying to each other and always stealing from each other, that sort of thing, and always bumping each other over or whatever, or scamming each other. You just can't get much else done. You're always trying to protect your stuff. You're always trying to make weird backroom deals, and you're always looking over your shoulder and these sorts of things. So Kant thinks the idea that we could even have a civilization where we didn't have a categorical imperative to tell the truth just doesn't make any sense at all. Problem is, for Kant, he really thinks that always telling the truth is something we need to follow all the time without exception, just like not enslaving people. It's absolutely always and only the wrong thing to do. What this means is if I'm here, you're over here at you are over here at my place. I don't know, we're listening to some records and talking about programming, and the famous Seb killer comes to the door with an axe, and I see the famous Seb killer coming, and I hide. I say, tell them I'm not here. Well then, Kant thinks that you are absolutely permitted, indeed you're obligated to try and change their minds about killing me, because killing someone is the wrong thing to do. But you're also obligated to tell them the truth. Like if they ask you if I'm here, absolutely you must tell them the truth. There are no exceptions to this whatsoever. Most people seem to think that this is a problem with crude Kantianism. Once they've reflected on it a little bit, at the beginning, however, a lot of people, especially sort of second-year philosophers, or just philosophy students, are just like, no, that's right. I have a moral obligation to tell the truth and do the right thing. Absolutely. I mean, if the axe murderer is then going to go and kill you, Seb, I mean, it's the axe murderer's responsibility to reason themselves in line with the categorical imperative to try and stop themselves from murdering you with the axe. But it's I have a moral imperative to tell the truth. And Seb, you're just being selfish. You're threatening the categorical imperative. And this can lead to something a little bit like maybe that there's something like a latent contradiction swimming around beneath the surface with Kantian deontological ethics here, because don't you have a moral obligation to try and save my life? But to try and save my life, it seems like you do, but to try and save my life, you're also obstructing somebody else from acting out or realizing their true, genuine will. So let's suppose they really do have a true and genuine will to do me in with the axe. How can you respect both duties here? There are contemporary deontological ethicists that have all sorts of answers to these things. There are hybrid ethicists that take a little bit of contemporary deontological ethics and a little bit of rule utilitarianism and mix them together somewhat, but we're not going to worry about that here. It's just a general overview. All I want you to really take away from this is, see humans as a device. If you can remember this, see humans as a device operating in their environment. Consequentialists use empirical data to upgrade, to try and upgrade the operating system that governs the behavior of the human devices, whereas the Kantian ethicists do not. They use pure algorithmic refinement that they believe they can arrive at just by thinking about it very, very carefully, because they're very clever. Hopefully this is not utterly mysterious. Are there any questions about any of this at all so far until I launch headfirst into virtue ethics, which is something very different, as we'll see. And by the way, if any of you email me for the pre-recorded lecture link, I'll just send it to you by email as well, because I'm sure that there must be inter-student chat groups all over the place. I mean, send the link around far and wide is what I would recommend. Okay. I'm not going to start just yet, because every time I think I've waited long enough, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a piece of chocolate whilst we wait to see if there are any questions. Oh, what a great idea. And Asuya, thank you for putting chocolate back in my mind. Yum. And now I'm feeling happy. Okay. Now, virtue ethics is older than consequentialism. Is even older than Kantian ethics. It goes all the way back to Aristotle and to Confucius and to Buddha. Buddhist ethics, Confucian ethics, and Aristotelian ethics are all different varieties of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics has seen a really large revival in the last half a century. The revival has been motivated, by and large, by a really serious dissatisfaction with either consequentialist ethics or or Kantian ethics, or both. And what that dissatisfaction is the following. It seems to the virtue ethicists that both the consequentialist and the Kantian are trying to eliminate morality. The the utilitarian is trying to replace all thinking and talk of morality with talk about happiness and suffering. It's almost like they've gone along to, wait, I've worked something out. There's no such thing as morality as we've been thinking about it, but something really real there. What we've been talking about all the time is actually happiness and suffering and utility. And the Kantians say, well, look, what we've been doing all the time, although I don't know if Kant would have thought that. I think Kant would have thought that what we should have been thinking about all the time was how it is that we can use pure reason to arrive at moral principles, and we've just been thinking about morality the wrong way. The virtue ethicist said, look, there's more. Surely happiness has something to do with working out what the right and wrong thing is to do, but it can't be all of it. And surely, our ability to think rationally has got some serious role to play with us being morally responsible and ethical people. But it can't be everything. We're leaving something out. I mean, what space does utilitarianism leave for things like loyalty and love and friendship? Really brutal utilitarians will say simply, well, if you have a choice between saving 5 lives and saving 1, you should save the 5. That's the right moral thing to do. But what if that one person is one of my oldest, dearest friends, and the 5 people are complete strangers? This is what, do we have anything like a duty to loyalty? How happy would people be if there was no interpersonal friendship or loyalty? What about spending time doing things other than the raw pursuit of maximizing utility? What about time spent with art and music and sport and poetry and cooking and food and chocolate and so on? All of these things that are not obviously maximizing utility in general. The brutal utilitarian seems to leave no room for doing anything like this at all. Rather, our lives should be dedicated to maximizing utility across the board. But wouldn't that be to leave something out that's terribly important to us and absolutely has value, and might even have value of a not obviously non-moral variety? And this is the sort of thing that motivates the virtue ethicist. Now, the virtue ethicist takes motives really, really seriously. Whether or not an action is the right action or not, morally speaking, for the virtue ethicist depends not on its consequences, not on whether it satisfies some algorithm like the categorical imperative, but it depends on the reasons, the motivations you had for acting in that way. However, for the virtue ethicist, those motivations are going to be emotions. Emotions play a central role for virtue ethics, and both consequentialism in general, to say nothing of utilitarianism, consequentialism, and Kantian ethics, see absolutely no role for the emotions at all. Whereas for virtue ethicists, they think that the emotions should have an absolutely central role to play for any system of normative ethics itself, if that system of ethics is going to be a sort of whole of life goal, whole of life task, a whole of life business. And virtue ethics is a very holistic approach to normative ethics. As far as virtue ethicists, especially of an Aristotelian stripe, are concerned, the point of ethics is to live well, is to live, the good life, to live the right kind of life. And the way you do that is, this is my favorite one. If someone truly believes that they're doing the right thing, that is the right thing to do, is my understanding of this. Well, they might have, that's such a great take on it, that might be slightly stronger than what some virtue ethicists want to say. Slightly stronger. I think they're going to say that believing that they're doing the right thing really honestly, as it is at very least, or it's at very least a necessary condition on doing the right thing, even if it's not sufficient. But as we're going to see, they don't really see them as reasons. What the way virtue ethicists think about this is like, look, if you're thinking you need to have some kind of reason that you can present for why it is that you acted one way as opposed to another within the space of moral argument, then you're just making a category error. We shouldn't be thinking about acting one way as opposed to another, ethically speaking, in terms of reasons. We do the right thing not because we've thought about it, but because we have a moral core, right? And this moral core is tied up really constitutively with emotions. Emotions are like a faculty of perception for the virtue ethicists. We haven't quite got to how yet, but this is really radically different to either consequentialist or Kantian ethicists. They just say like, no. You don't. When we're talking about doing the right thing, we're not. The rightness of that thing in no way depends on us being able to present reasons. Rather, it's about what moved us to act, and what moves us to act is our character, the type of person that we are, the whole person, the whole personhood. The whole point of moral training, according to the virtue ethicist, is to improve one's character. We can reflect on and improve and refine our character. We never reach an end goal. There's no perfect character that we have, right? Maybe a saint is supposed to be somebody with a perfect character, but for us, definitely for me, and certainly for Inky, Inky's pretty shady, The point for us is that it is a constant, lifelong practice of continuing to refine our character. But what is a person's character? This idea of character is doing so much work for the virtue ethicist, but what is it? Well, one's character is just one set of dispositions to act. One's character is just dispositions to act as just like the likelihood that one will act in a certain way given certain circumstances. Like if a facet of my character is that I'm pretty honest, like I usually tell the truth most of the time, and I tell you that, but then every time you see me talking to people and there's something on the line and I'm always just lying, then that's not a part of my character at all. I mean, I can tell you that I have a disposition to tell the truth, but that doesn't make it true, right? I have to actually act like that. But if there's that slogan, judge a person not by their words, but by their deeds, by their actions. It's the way they behave that betrays their character, not what they tell you, right? Not what they tell you at all. So what are the virtues? The virtues are certain properties of our character, that is, the virtues are dispositions to act in certain ways that are good ways, according to the virtue ethicist. They're good ways to act. Examples of virtues are things like honesty, bravery, kindness, gentleness, temperance, and so on. The virtues. Just most cultures out there will have versions of the virtues in one way or another. And in our computer science or programming analogy, think of virtue ethics as something like machine learning. The machine is just learning from within its environment how it is that it should and shouldn't act, given that it's trying to optimize itself. Right? Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, virtue ethicists think there's no set of rules we can look up. Rather, it depends on us being brought up well or being raised well. You know, this is how we get the virtues. But how do we do this? Well, this is where the emotions come in, right? This is fascinating. What the virtue ethicists think is that our ability to have emotional reactions to things, that is our faculty of emotions, are a system of perceptions. Our faculties of emotional response to states of affairs are the way that we perceive moral values in the world. Virtue ethicists think that moral properties or moral values are real things in the world. We don't perceive them with our eyeballs. We don't perceive them through our faculties of reasoning. We don't perceive them by looking at consequences. Rather, we perceive them by attending to our own emotional response. How do we know that we're having the right emotional response to situations or states of affairs in the world? Well, we don't at first. We need to be raised well. We need to be raised by an entire community of people with good character, right? So I'll give you an example. You know, if you see a little kid sort of torturing animals or burning ants with a magnifying glass, you see like a little kid teasing another little kid and getting happy because they've hurt another animal or made another child upset. We usually respond in such a way as though we think, wow, there's something wrong morally with this child. They're heading down the wrong moral path. And the way to set them on the right moral path is to get them to attend to their own emotions. And often you encourage children to have empathy. We say things to children like, how would you feel if that person did that to you, or if somebody did that to you? And don't you realize how upset they are and how disappointed I am in you, and this sort of thing? And often when you make little kids reflect and grow their internal emotional space, it's really quite traumatizing. I mean, emotions can be really quite overwhelming. They're really powerful. The whole point of virtue ethics is that we need to learn to fine-tune our emotional responses in such a way that, firstly, we're not completely blind to them, so we're not just sociopaths who have no emotional response to states of affairs in the world at all, but neither are we overwhelmed and just crushed with panic attacks and anxiety and just completely overwhelmed by our emotions. Rather, the emotions should guide us to what the actual, apparent, real, instantiated moral properties are in any particular situation, and that will in turn inform us as to what the right course of action will be if in fact we possess the right virtue in question. And we can have too much of an emotion or too little of it, and if we have either too much or too little, they will lead us not to virtuous actions but rather to vices. So I'll have an example here. One example makes this clear. Consider the emotion of fear, and we're looking at some dangerous situation, and the emotion of fear should take us to the virtue of bravery and tell us what to do, what the brave thing would be to do in that particular situation. Who knows what it is? It's a burning house or something like this. Now, if we have too much of the emotion of fear, it will lead us to being a coward in that situation. And cowardice is not a virtue, it's a vice. If we have too little fear, well, we won't be a coward, we won't suffer from the vice of cowardice, but rather we'll be reckless or rash or foolhardy. And these are all vices that we have from having not enough fear at all. Like fear, the right amount of fear, is quite a good guide to how to act sensibly and bravely in very dangerous situations. And the amount of bravery that would be the correct amount for one person as opposed to another depends on the person and what their role is. You know, if I'm a surf lifesaver, the right thing to do, the virtuous thing to do is to jump into big surf to save the drowning child. If I'm not and I'm not trained, then that's a foolhardy thing to do, because now all I'm doing is causing there to be two people as opposed to one who need their lives saved in dangerous surf, and I'm going to cause more people to risk their lives to save me. So it's really going to depend, but hopefully like the running idea is clear, and this is why the virtue ethicists think that the passions are rational. The emotions are actually rational things, rather than being a threat to how it is we think about moral reasoning. Rather, the emotions play an absolutely ineliminable, non-reducible, non-eliminatable, completely necessary role when it comes to being a morally good person and thinking about what the right thing is to do, morally speaking, because the right thing to do, morally speaking, is the virtuous thing. And to know what the virtuous thing is to do, we need to attend to our emotional responses, and we need to attend to them within a community and culture where this sort of thing is encouraged, where we're encouraged to have what these days is called emotional intelligence. Now, just to add one trick on top of another, Aristotle will think that it's not virtuous to have one virtue at the expense of all others. I mean, being honest is a virtue, but not at the expense of being kind. So if telling the truth in one particular situation would also be incredibly unkind, I mean, just so so hurtful that you shouldn't do it, then Aristotle thinks you need to exercise the virtue of temperance and so on, and pull yourself back a little bit. Aristotle has a name for this sort of executive virtue, or a guiding virtue, almost like a meta virtue, the virtue that balances all of the others. He calls it Phronesis, which is translated in contemporary English as practical wisdom. It's about knowing what to do in any particular situation, and no one virtue will tell you what to do. To have any of the virtues, according to Aristotle, to a sensible degree, you need to have sort of pretty much all of them, and you sort of emerge as a virtuous person after being raised and becoming an adult and assuming various roles of responsibility within a virtuous society, to be a good person, to live well, to live the good and virtuous and moral life. You're not just one human being alone on an island like the Kantian would think was entirely possible, but rather we need to be incredibly intelligent and sensitive emotionally in order to understand what the emotional consequences are of all of our actions, and the emotional consequences are of the situations that we are observing and that we find ourselves a part of. And one of the big criticisms here of virtue ethics is that, look, it doesn't give any clear or simple answer to what the right or wrong thing is to do in any given situation. A lot of contemporary virtue ethicists say, yes, you are absolutely right. And this is one of the great virtues of virtue ethics. It's to admit that moral reasoning is extremely difficult. They say if we're honest with ourselves, some of the hardest decisions we will ever have to make as living human beings will be decisions of morality and ethics. It's not a simple business. The idea that we could just execute the categorical imperative or reflect upon consequences and then be done with it, the idea that moral reasoning could be reduced to the sort of thing a 10-year-old could read on the back of a packet of cereal, and then rush off and calculate, is just wrong-headed from the start and are quite dangerous, morally speaking. And the virtue ethicists say this is why there are so many immediate and obvious counterexamples to the really dogmatic versions of consequentialist ethics on the one hand and Kantian deontological ethics on the other. And this is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics has seen a huge explosion of popularity within the ethics of technology, the ethics of information, the ethics of computers and design, one of the great authors, I'll write this in, Shannon Valor. Is that written properly? Yes, it is. I'm writing this in the chat. Shannon Valor. Look up Shannon's work. She is an absolute genius, a wonderful technologist, and a great moral philosopher as well. And she's written a great book at the moment, the title of which is escaping me. It's something like Virtues for the Technological Age, or these sorts of things. So thank you so much for spending your Tuesday afternoon here with me talking about normative ethics. Inky thanks you also. And now I'm more than happy to stay here chatting with you for as long as it takes until we've discussed things to the extent that hopefully not massively unclear. As long as things are not massively unclear, I'll be relatively happy. But in all seriousness, I would love to hear your questions or discuss your points of view with you now. So over to you. Thanks again. Goodness, I hope the virtue ethics didn't scare anybody off. Or everybody off, for that matter. Aha, okay. Intentional. Have I watched a TV show? The Good Place. It's a guy. No, you are the... Everyone, I really should, and so thank you so much. I have not seen The Good Place, but you are not the first person to ask me about this. Oh, Fatally Orange, to be honest, I have no idea what you're talking about mostly, but it's nice. That I'm a Fatally Orange. I'm so this, especially without philosophy. This is like a rush into an overview of what could easily be an entire term's worth of material. It really is. There is a great book. What is it? What is the name? I remember now. What is... Oops. Is this thing called ethics? Okay, that is a great book by Bennett. That's a great introduction to this area if you'd like to know more. Hopefully that's, if you're super curious. But Fatally Orange, was there a particular point that on which you'd like me to elaborate? If or a couple that think about it and let me know. But if the whole thing was just a torrent of conceptual machinery that was all a little bit abstract, I do appreciate this. This is abstract stuff. Great question from Answer. Have I ever had a situation in my career where I've had to make a hard moral choice and you had to use this knowledge in practice? Yeah, absolutely, quite a few times. So you probably the most serious ones are when students have come to me and said, look, I really need your help, because often, often enough, especially in first year, and especially when we were all face to face and everything, for some people, academics at university will be the sort of some of the first adults that they'll get to know really well, outside of their family or teachers at school or relatives or their friends' parents. Some of the first adults that they get to know really well that their family doesn't know one way or the other, right? That, this is certainly the case for me. So often students will, if you're an academic, they certainly have to me to say, wow, Seb, I've got it, here's like this thing. And I'd be like, wow, that is definitely, definitely a thing. And we have to just sit down together and work out what the right thing is to do. In other situations, I've been caught between what university rules say that I have to do on the one hand, and what I really strongly believe that the right thing is to do on the other. And that's this real tension between sort of representing the institution on the one hand and representing yourself on the other. But I think I'm not a fan in general of excusing moral incompetence by saying I was just following the rules. So I think, although obviously I can't repeat anything that any student has told me, I can repeat plenty of examples where the universities have done things that I've thought was wrong, and I've gone to sort of fight for it. I think a great example would be, a student can't have an extension for longer than 2 days unless they apply for special consideration. And this was at the University of Sydney. Every university here it's a bit different, and the way that special consideration works is this absolutely unworkable behemoth, this terrible nightmare of bureaucracy and websites that don't work, and online forms, and you have to upload all of these documents, and they've all got to be verified, and it goes on and on and on and on. I mean, it is more work navigating this stuff than it just would be to do the assessment. It's the sort of thing that will just frankly do anybody's head in, even if they're not sick, right? So when people are really unwell, it's not obvious that it's justifiable to ask them to navigate this sort of thing, especially if they're unwell mentally. Then it's the last thing that you have the sort of stamina for. We don't put physical access officers at the top of flights of 50 steps. I mean, that's obviously unreasonable. So why do we put access points for say mental health special consideration behind your 20 layers of mentally exhausting online bureaucracy? So plenty of times in the past I've simply said, well, I know what the right thing is here to do, and I can come to a perfectly sensible arrangement with the students in question, and the universities doesn't really need to know about it, and there is just no way that I could live with myself morally. I think it's the wrong thing to do, to tell the student, no, you have to go off and spend a week trying to find all of these different documents from different people. I mean, it's just cruel, right? So, I mean, they're the sorts of things where I had to sort of balance virtues here, right? Definitely balance some virtues. Lots of cases like that, I think, in my career. It's definitely balancing a whole bunch of competing interests. Others are where people will really do the wrong thing, and you're thinking, well, how do we firstly fix the situation, and then secondly, how do we get them to recognize that that was the wrong thing? And that sort of thing requires a lot of temperance, and quite often the person who's just done the wrong thing is me. I've gone into a situation blindly, and I've thought I'm doing the wrong thing morally and helping, but I've actually just made things worse. I'm like, wow, I got that so catastrophically wrong. I need to make sure I never do it like that again, and get better at being a person. Yeah, absolutely. Especially virtue ethics. I think especially virtue ethics. Great questions. From Fatally Orange, I'm leaning forward because the font is teensy. I think there's a lot of new terminology and words I don't quite understand. Mostly got me from base and how you were talking about them. Yeah, there is. I mean, I was only defining things once. There's a lot of new jargon here, an absolute big bowl of it. But the all of the definitions I gave you and all of the terms that I've used, they're all canonical, right? So if you look up utilitarianism, or you look up Kantian ethics or deontological ethics, or you look up virtue ethics, you'll find, or Aristotelian ethics, you will find canonical proper descriptions of them and explanations of them. All of the entries from excuse me, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy are fantastic. I would post a link to that in the chat, but apparently those links are going just not going to get through because the YouTube thingy strips the links. I apologize for that. Any other questions from anyone? Oh, it's not looking like it. I'll tell you what, I'll wait until 10:02. It's another 2 whole minutes. And frankly, if the lag is that bad, no questions are going to come through anyway. Ah, Anasu, thank you so much. I knew what you meant. Oh, that's fantastic. I'm delighted to be here. I've got to say, I have worked in universities all over the world. I met students all over the world. The only other place, and I've visited them all over the world as well. I can say there are only 3 places that have been, or 2, wait, that was such a weird sentence. There are only 2 other universities where I've been where just that excitement on campus and the passion is so real, and everyone in the schools and departments is running around helping everyone else. There are only 2 other places that I've ever been in my life that have been like as good and as much fun as UNSW. One is the University of Oxford, where I studied for 5 years, and I was a lecturer at St. Anne's College there, and that was just unreal. That was just like one of the most fun years of my life, just because everyone was so into it, you know, and into helping each other. And it was people like running around all the time, and you walk around the campus at UNSW and people like running and calling out and doing stuff. Other university campuses, oh my goodness, yeah, it's just, the atmosphere is pretty heavy. You know, it's like the difference between one school and another. That's how a friend of mine chose high schools for his children. He drove around, it was a bit weird, but it worked. He drove around to all of the high schools that he was even vaguely considering sending his kids, and those the really expensive ones are supposed to be really, really good. And all of the kids were leaving like they just spent the entire day having their personalities destroyed. You know, they looked so emotionally drained. They're all okay. No one was smiling or laughing. If anyone was interacting with anyone else, they were sort of jeering and being antagonistic. He was going, well, I'm clearly not sending my children there. That's a horrible place. I mean, look at the state they're in. I know one of the schools he looked, I'll tell you the one he showed. He ended up stalking Mossman High. And when everyone was leaving Mossman High at the end of the day, they're all laughing and giggling and jumping up and down and grabbing each other and chatting and everyone. And not in a rush. They just hang around and doing this, that, or the other, and being really friendly and really excited. Everyone was like full of emotional and physical energy. And he's like, wow, this is such a great place to send my children. I'm going to send them there. And I think as far as a decision procedure for picking a school for your child goes, that one is pretty good. The other place apart from Oxford was let me get the whole name right. Let me just Google this to make sure I get, because I'm sure there are a whole bunch of universities in China with similar names like there are in London and stuff, and I'll just pick the wrong one. And now I remember. Yeah, Southwest University in Chongqing, Beibei. Southwest University. In the Beibei district, yeah, that was it for sure. That was just so much fun. I was there for 2 weeks many, many, many years ago in 2009. And the energy in the air was absolutely electric. So, Anasuya, thanks so much for saying so. It's also, I really got to emphasize this. UNSW and CSC in particular, it's just awesome. I don't know if anyone's sort of been a spy at Campus Coffee or whatever it's called, the cafe at the bottom of the Ainsworth building, right near K17. A lot of students and staff from CSE go there all day, every day. So now everyone knows the secret, and everyone's just sitting around like super excited and really energetic and talking about all the courses they're going to teach and the research that they're doing and how they're going to make this bit better than that bit, and they can't wait for this thing to happen and everything, and what are they going to do to fix this, and asking for help. And it's just, a lot of universities are not like this, I can promise you. Not at all. It's really, really unique. And it's like this because of you, because of the people who are there. I think it's like this because as our head of school, as Aaron Quigley said to me the other day, he said, do you know who the stars are of our university, like our real stars? And I said, no, who? And he said, our students, like our students are the stars. And he really means this, and so do a lot of other people. I really think it shows. That's what makes it such a great place to be. I'm walking around at 10 o'clock at night there, and there was still a whole bunch of you. Okay, you're looking slightly tired by 10 p.m., but you are still there doing a whole bunch of work and helping each other. And that is awesome. Really, really awesome. We're coming up to the end of the allotted time. Sasha, I know that you are eavesdropping. If you wouldn't mind jumping onto Teams afterwards so that we could debrief briefly, that would be fantastic. And don't forget, everyone, not only will Sasha will make it obvious where the the pre-recorded video for this content is, and you can watch it over and over again, which will be really fantastic at like high speed or low speed. And it will you can, it's YouTube, it has subtitles and stuff as well. But also, if you have the time, it's no obligation. Before the Friday time window, do try and pre-watch the video I made today. It's not online yet, but it will be later on tonight, on meta ethics. Now, you don't know what meta ethics is yet, but we're going to talk about meta ethics on Friday. Meta ethics is wild, right? You think normative ethics has a whole bunch of terminology. You just wait until you see what moral theorists have done with meta ethics, and you don't even know what it is yet. But you'll be fine. Now I have to resist the urge to not eat too much chocolate before dinner. Thank you, Anasuya, for your great questions as well. They're unreal. Okay, everyone, thank you. I've had a lot of fun. I hope that you have too. Right, I'm looking really forward to Friday now. I was before, but now I'm looking even more forward. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a great Tuesday evening. I'm off to have an adventurous dinner somewhere after Sasha and I have a chat. Okay, everyone. Thanks so much. Oh, thank you, Xavier.